All right, so thank you everyone for joining this webinar. It's about 3 p.m. Gonna give it a little bit more time for people to join. We are recording. We'll post this on YouTube later. Um, really excited for everyone joining today. I think we have one more panelist who will hopefully join soon. But I'm going to start with kind of an introduction about the League's Slow Roads Save Lives campaign and initiative. Um, and I'll give a little lead in for our three excellent panelists before handing it over to them. So we're just after 3, so I'm gonna get it started. Panelists, you are free to keep your cameras on for this section, or feel free to turn your cameras off now and turn them back on when it is your turn to speak later. But welcome to the League of American Bicyclists' third webinar in our Slow Roads Saves Lives series. My name is Ken McLeod. I'm the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. I'm honored to be joined by 3 speakers who will share their experiences with recent legislation aimed at creating slower roads that saves lives today. So Sarah Iana Roan is the executive director of the Street Trust in Oregon. Mackenzie Racy is the acting assistant general manager of external affairs with Los Angeles Department of Transportation in California. And Jay Crossley is the executive director of Farm & City in Texas. So we'll get to them after my short introduction. So the Slow Roads Saves Lives campaign has a simple idea at its core, that slower speeds save lives due to the physics of crashes and the physical limitations of human bodies when they're impacted by large and fast objects. In this webinar, we will discuss the role that state laws play in how roads are designed and signed for safer or more dangerous speeds. State laws are an expression of our culture. Yeah. State laws are an expression of our culture, made up of these layers of the social environment that determine our traffic safety culture. And when laws do not support slower speeds, they communicate that faster traffic is more important than the safety of people on our streets. So there are at least 2 very important reasons for caring about state speed limit laws. One, laws that set speed limits typically act as the default speed limit. Absent any other action, a state that has chosen a residential district speed limit of 30 miles per hour is likely to get residential streets designed and signed so that people can comfortably drive 30 miles per hour where people live. At 30 miles per hour, a person hit by a vehicle traveling at the legal speed limit will have a 1 in 4 chance of death, compared to a 1 in 10 chance if the speed was 20 miles per hour. At least 11 states have set their residential district speed limit at 30 miles per hour or higher. And at least 19 states have set their urban district speed limit at 30 miles per hour or higher, requiring action by local agencies and local advocates to implement safer speed limits. 2, laws that set speed limits typically act as the minimum speed for the design of a road. According to a Transportation Research Board report on design speed, operating speed, and posted speed practices, a majority of states use the legal posted speed limit when selecting a design speed for a roadway, and many choose a design speed of 5 or 10 miles per hour over the legal speed limit. Absent any other action, this means that in states with a residential district speed limit of 30 miles per hour, the residential streets in those districts, whether passing parks, schools, or busy bicycle corridors, will be designed around people driving 30 to 40 miles per hour. State speed limit laws can act as powerful enablers of safer speeds or act as significant barriers to safer speeds. They can make safer speed limits easy to implement or make them difficult, costly, and rare. With our driver pledge, we ask people to pledge to drive 20 miles per hour in their neighborhoods, despite knowing that in many places this is below the speed limit. We do this because we believe that the value of safety on the block or 2 next to where you live, walk, and play is more important than speed. As the saying goes, 20 is plenty, and the current legal barriers to posting 20 mile per hour speed limits that exist in many states should not prevent our individual actions to establish a slower, safer norm, at least for a block or 2 around your house or apartment. So our driver pledge says, I, as an individual driver, support the Slow Roads Save Lives campaign. And I pledge to embrace slower speeds by speaking up for the value of slow speeds, which reduce dangers to everyone by limiting physical forces of potential crashes, supporting transformational policy and roadway designs, which help make roads slower and safer for everyone, driving 20 miles per hour in my neighborhood on the blocks where my family and my neighbors live, walk, and play, and driving with an intention of speed limit compliance at all times, recognizing that I control the speed of my vehicle. With our Slow Roads Saves Lives campaign, we have a goal of 20-mile-per-hour streets being legal, planned for, and celebrated. Setting speed limits to minimize injury and death for people and safety first is a safe, legitimate, and objective approach to managing speeds for safety. State speed limit law reform is a necessary step in many states towards the goal of 20-mile-per-hour streets. So I'm excited to hand it over to our guests today to talk more about their efforts with state speed limit law reforms and creating slower, safer streets. If she has joined, and she has, we're going to start with Sarah Iannarone, Executive Director of the Street Trust in Oregon, where in 2022, state law allowed Oregon cities and some counties to apply for the authority to designate speed limits on their roads, rather than get approval for each speed limit change from the state DOT. Then we'll go to Mackenzie Racy, Acting Assistant General Manager of External Affairs with Los Angeles Department of Transportation in California, where in 2022, the city identified over 170 miles of streets for speed limit reductions after a change in state law allowed speed limits to be reduced in several circumstances. And then finally, we'll go to Jay Crossley, Executive Director of Farm and City in Texas, where state law changes are being considered to remove existing restrictions on speed limits under 30 miles per hour, and where the state strategic highway safety plan has noted that Texas law bars cities from using 20-mile-per-hour speed limits on neighborhood streets. So we hope you enjoy and are inspired by this webinar. Slow roads are good roads, and the changes to bring about slower, safer streets are as monumental as those that brought us the paved, fast roads of today. Our existing traffic safety culture is too often dismissive of demands for slower speeds, and by speaking up, embodying slower speeds as drivers, and building a slow roads movement together, we can create a new culture of safer streets that recognizes the power of slower speeds. And with that, I'm very happy to hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. Did you want me to share screen from my slide deck here?
Yes, I should be able to make you host, and that will enable you to share.
Perfect. Let's see if we can do this here. All right. Well, hi, everybody, and thanks for spending some time, talking about this important issue today. And thanks for hosting all of us for this important conversation. I want to preface this with some sobering news. We had the deadliest year in decades. Again, year over year, we're seeing increases in fatalities for people walking, biking, and trying to access transit. And I was just reading a news story right before this came on, where we had the deadliest year even for people involved with crashes with transit vehicles. And the one thing that I stressed in my comment for that article was how important a safe systems approach is, and how important it is that we design streets where human error isn't irrelevant, but actually a factor. And so thinking about all of the things that we need to deploy is really critical. Lower speeds are necessary, but wholly insufficient. So let me just give you a little bit of background. This is a picture of a protest on Outer Division Street, a high equity neighborhood where stroads, as you know, here we call them often orphan highways, our deadliest arterials are where a majority of these fatal crashes happen. And you can see there us holding a 20 is plenty speed limit sign. But the city of Portland, which is the largest in Oregon, has been fighting since 2009 to secure local control over speed limit reductions. And many of you may have heard, once upon a time, Portland was considered a transportation leader. I feel like we've dropped the baton on that a little bit. I am excited to be leapfrogged and see other places superseding what we're able to accomplish. But at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And so I just wanted to give you a little background of what got us to here today. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed Senate Bill 558, which gave Oregon cities the ability to decrease speed limits by 5 miles per hour below statutory speed limits on non-arterial streets and residence districts, as you mentioned. And then the Oregon Transportation Commission, which oversees policy for our transportation department and also the budget, updated its administrative rules to provide guidance and to ensure statewide consistency. So that all happened in 2019. Some of the calls that persisted for local control related to the lag time. Even as permissions were being increased, there was a lag time between when the state DOT and local jurisdictions requesting reductions, we're getting approval, staff shortages, engineering shortages. There's one staffer per 5 zones in Oregon and only one engineer who was reviewing those. So the lag time could take up to a year. There were increasing professional concerns, as many of you know, with that 85% tile speed framework. And some folks were even at that point in the profession resisting the 50% speed. And so what was going to be the frame that we could use to focus speeds on increasing safety and, again, the rising pedestrian fatalities in particular, but also for people bicycling. So State Rep Rod Noss, along with some others, talked about a reframe and thinking about how we should set speed limits based on how fast motorists should be driving, not how fast they want to and are driving, which relates to that 50th and 85th percentile framing. So in 2020, House Bill 4103 passed, which further expanded local oversight of speeds. There were still a lot of hoops for local jurisdictions to jump through, but it continued the movement forward on local control over speeds. Then in 2021, House Bill 3055 passed. It was the most comprehensive to date. And what it did was allow further expansion of the locals overseeing the reduction of designated speed limits depending on local context and engineering designs. Now, there were still, again, quite a few hoops for local jurisdictions to jump through on here. The law does apply to 241 cities in Oregon and unincorporated parts of Multnomah and Clackamas County, which are in the Portland metro area. Other unincorporated parts of other counties still need to rely on state officials to make speed limit changes. And there are still plenty of hoops to jump through, including training, approval, engineering reviews, etc. But with each passage, it gets better and better. And one of the caveats that I wanted to offer is that, as much as we made progress on safety via House Bill 3055, that 77-page legislation trended toward omnibus transportation package, and there were some really unsavory elements of it as well. So it was a bit of a mixed bag for us in the advocacy community, because I called it financial gerrymandering. But as Oregon seeks new revenue streams, historically, we have used gas tax revenue and freight heavy vehicle taxes to pay for our highways, and this created some merged pots of revenue streams, including some new revenue streams that we're looking at, like tolling, which would then increase our DOT's capacity for freeway expansion projects, which they are using, as congestion relief projects, which is not new to any of you. It's happening across the country, but for us, again, it was hard to celebrate the speed limit reductions in House Bill 3055 because we had to swallow some of these other elements. There are some good things happening, though, on the legislative front to help us reduce speeds as well. So automated traffic enforcement, we're seeing much progress. There have been subsequent bills. One that we're really excited about is civilian review in City of Portland, which expands our capacity to administer the automated traffic enforcement. Another one is the Jurisdictional Transfer Advisory Committee. As I mentioned before, these orphan highways, so state highways that were once intended for fast-moving traffic where urban areas have grown up around them. We lack the money to bring them up to complete street standards. So we're setting up a framework that's equity and climate focused, whereby we start prioritizing these deadly stroads for transfer from the state DOT to local jurisdictions, where some of them have more strict standards for speed, but also better standards for design, including for people walking, biking, and trying to access transit. We're focused on creating new pots of money. One is the Great Streets, Complete Streets Funding Program via House Bill 3113. We didn't get a lot of money last session, only $1 million towards that. But we are going back in 2025 for a transportation omnibus package, which I have as that last bullet point. And in 2024, the Street Trust will be hosting the Oregon Active Transportation Summit, where we'll be working through a lot of our transportation funding priorities, as well as spending priorities from the community side to help realize a people's transportation package. So I hope I caught everything you wanted us to share there, and I'm guessing we'll take questions at the end.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And we do plan to take questions at the end. So if you're an attendee, use that question and answer utility to ask your question. I know I have a couple, and it's just amazing to me how long these efforts take to change speed limits. So I really appreciate the persistence and effort. And it's very unfortunate that you had to kind of swallow the unfortunate part of the funding issue. But it's a really seemingly positive speed limit change. I need to ask you for the hosting privilege back, or for you to transfer it to Mackenzie. So sorry about that.
The good news is I don't have any slides, so you can take your time.
Okay, well, we figure that out. I guess you can start your presentation.
Great, well, thank you so much. I did not prepare slides today. I just wanted to talk everybody through some of the success we've had here in Los Angeles and California, and what I think has been really effective at changing some of these laws. And I'll just start by saying here in LA, we also had our deadliest year of traffic crashes on record. We had, I think, 337 deaths last year. That's higher than homicides. Traffic crashes are now the leading cause of death county-wide for people under 30 here in LA. So we are working really hard to reverse that trend. And where we deliver safe streets design, we really do see a reduction in high-end speeding, in average speeds, and in crashes. But citywide, our individual projects are not reversing the full trend. And so state legislation is another tool, another approach we have to improve safety. So while we're succeeding at changing some of the behavior on our streets, we're also working to change some of these laws that are really holding us back from fully achieving our safety goals. So for us, project delivery and state legislation really is a yes and solution. We're working hard at both. My part of the work happens to be the legislative piece. So here in California, we've relied on the 85th percentile to set and update speed limits for decades. And under that rule, where cities are required to set our speed limits based on how fast people are already driving, we found that just after we launched Vision Zero, many of our speed surveys had expired, and we needed to update the speed limits in order to make them enforceable. And when we went to reestablish our speed limits so that they could be enforced, we found that many of them were going to increase by at least 5 miles per hour, sometimes more. So we're in this situation where we are starting to get really serious about improving traffic safety. We just launched our Vision Zero campaign. And instead of reducing speed limits on our streets, which we know will improve safety, we have to choose between speed limits that are unenforceable or higher speed limits where drivers will be held accountable. And that was a really difficult choice for a lot of our local electeds to make. You know, do they want to increase the legal limit to make sure there's accountability, or do they want to leave that safer limit, knowing that there will be no mechanism for accountability on the street, and that speed limits could in fact continue to rise? And, before this, 85th percentile reform had been a goal for many advocates, but this really put it on the top of our legislative priorities here at LADOT. The first attempt we made at changing the vehicle code that governs the 85th percentile resulted in a task force focused on reducing traffic fatalities, and included a wide range of stakeholders, and resulted in a study that outlined many recommendations, including, unsurprisingly, reforming the 85th percentile. That report from the task force gave us some evidence, a tool that we needed so we could make another attempt at changing that code. And our second attempt made very specific sort of surgical changes to setting speed limits. But that first bill did not make it, or that second bill really did not make it through the legislature. Third time is the charm. And in October 2021, Assembly Bill 43 by Assemblymember Laura Friedman was signed into law. It became law January 2023. And we were able to reduce speed limits on nearly 200 miles of city streets where we had previously increased them. So it was a huge win for the city of LA and for safety on our streets. But why were we successful a third time? It wasn't just that we kept going back and going back. There were a few things that we specifically improved and changed that third time. One is that the cities in California, the biggest DOTs in California, started working together through a coalition that we call CACTI, the California City Transportation Initiative. And through that coalition, we identified the very specific changes we were looking for in the law. We had a better ability to engage specific legislative members. And we also were able to connect our respective advocate groups. So we just built a much stronger coalition by sharing information and sharing strategies amongst our, I think it was 7 at the time, largest DOTs. We also built a very strong coalition of local voices who could speak for themselves when we were talking about lowering speed limits on city streets. So, the first few attempts at this bill, we had some fairly typical opposition, groups that represent motorists, represent police unions. But we also had some legislative offices really touting equity concerns. We had the ACLU concern that lower speed limits would lead to more tickets in poor Black and brown communities in particular, which is not, of course, what the city of LA wants to do. So we went to those communities and we said, well, what do you want? And to a person, they wanted slower speeds. They wanted safer streets. And so we worked with faith-based groups. We worked with families who had lost loved ones to traffic violence. And we talked to real constituents to hear what they needed. And then we brought them to Sacramento to speak for themselves. And I think that was the most powerful change in our successful attempt, is that once you're hearing from people in their communities who are, priests, parishioners sick of consoling families losing their loved ones, it becomes just a very compelling case and much harder to overlook. So that was our real success story for lowering speed limits here in Los Angeles. And I'll say each city in California really had a different piece of reform that they were focused on. For us, it was repealing speed limits on those streets that we had previously increased. But there are other provisions of the bill that allow for safer speed limits on high injury networks, around schools, in some specific locations. I think the sort of secret sauce to success that we used for that bill, we followed a similar strategy more recently to pursue another one of those task force recommendations, which is automated speed enforcement, or what we're calling speed safety cameras. And last year, again, in thanks to the leadership of Assemblymember Laura Friedman and a lot of advocates here in Los Angeles and statewide, we were authorized to launch speed safety camera pilots. And so we're working on that now to also improve driver accountability and safety. on our streets. So those have been two really big developments for us in the last couple of years that we hope will continue to lower driver speeds and really improve safety. That's it for me, Ken.
Awesome. Really appreciate you sharing your experience. It's great to hear how things changed over time as you worked through those task force recommendations and worked to address issues that were raised. And that the way you addressed equity issues is talking to those communities and that they wanted slower, safer streets. So we're excited to see that happening. Jay, you are hopefully now host and you will be able to share links and present, and hopefully it goes smoothly.
Okay, and I should also unmute. So hi, everybody. I'm executive director of a nonprofit called Fireman City. And we work across Texas public policy and across housing and transportation equity and sustainability issues. And but our biggest project is that we lead Vision Zero Texas, and we work with partners across the state on the movement to end traffic deaths in Texas. And so I actually have been working on and trying to get bills filed to change the speed limits in Texas since before Fireman City existed, when I used to work in an organization called Houston Tomorrow. And I share a little spreadsheet in the chat, which I hadn't done the number until sharing that spreadsheet, but we have in fact gotten 16 different bills filed to do this. And if you want to nerd out, you can look at the history of those bills. And last session, Texas only meets every 2 years. And we actually got the bill passed by the Texas House and by the Texas Senate, but it was different versions of the bills. And in the mix, it did not, in fact, make it over the finish line. So I think we're in very good shape next time to finally do this, but we'll see. But we've actually been through it all. And so if you look through that list, there are versions of the bill that would change the prima facie speed limit on neighborhood streets statewide. There's other versions of the bill that allow cities to change their speed limit, other versions that just remove some of the requirements. And where we've landed and where I hope we can pass next time is actually one of the better versions of the bill, which would allow cities to do 20-mile-an-hour speed limits where they feel like doing it on residential streets, and that's and take away a lot of the requirements about how they have to do that. And I guess one of the interesting parts about this many years of working on this is that so far we have not in fact changed Texas law, but we certainly have changed a lot. And that's part of our approach that I think people might think about, is that you can, one is talking about safe neighborhood streets. Every legislator has neighborhood associations that are mad about people driving fast on their streets. It's a terrific in to talk about Vision Zero and to talk about safety with basically anybody. And so to some extent, all the work we've done on this Safe Neighborhood Streets bill in some ways has really helped the rest of everything with Vision Zero in Texas. On the other hand, we have actually been trying to change other things just in state law. And so one big example is that we got very involved in the Texas Strategic Highway Safety Plan, the SHSP, and successfully got the issue of design speed and target speed and rethinking how we think about speed and speed limit setting included in the Texas Strategic Highway Safety Plan. And so there's another link I just shared. And so this is an action plan that's part of the state of Texas's plan to rethink how we think about target speeds. And so the fact that we got this done back in 2017, this has been changing things since then. And some of the things is the cities that are Vision Zero cities in Texas take this and run with it. And this is clear blessing from the state to do things differently. But also TxDOT has to some extent addressed this issue, and there were some changes to the Texas Highway Design Manual that are basically the concept of speed limit shall be based on design speed, which shall be based on target speed. And basically where we are at with TxDOT is arguing about the target speed and arguing about like what is the context and how should we decide how low that speed should be. But the concept of designing streets and then signing streets for the speeds we want, we actually have won that in Texas. But then we're arguing over what speed do we want at this time. And so we, in a way, we've made a lot of progress, but in a way, we have a long way to go. And I hope next year, let's see, next May, I hope to be reporting back to anyone that we finally done this and that Texas cities are allowed to change speed limits. A couple other key points, which kind of have brought up, but we've worked closely with all the cities over these years. And some of that is that in Texas, different cities have different interpretations. And one version of this bill 2 sessions ago, it actually was one of the big cities that messed it up. And then a previous version of the bill was one of the smaller cities that had a powerful legislator. And that small city thought somehow the bill was going to require them to change all their speed limits, and they didn't want to spend the money for the signs. And so working closely with cities as an advocate has been a crucial part of all this and helped us refine this bill and get it to where we think it can pass. Another note is that depending on your state, but here in Texas, counties also have streets that really are residential streets that they control. And so part of our work has been not the top priority, but we also are trying to work with the counties and to make this the idea of designing for appropriate speeds also something that county officials are thinking about. And then the final thing would be, if you don't know about it, we did basically push hard on the city of Austin and with local partners a while ago, back in 2016, got the Austin City Council to instruct staff to figure out a comprehensive speed management strategy, including lowering speed limits, changing design speeds, and investing in speed changes. And that the city of Austin has done amazing things, and so has changed speed limits as low as they can within state law. And so citywide in Austin, all residential streets are 25 now, and a bunch of bigger streets have been changed. But also the city of Austin is investing money, and when the city has done transportation bonds, there now is a chunk of money in those bonds that is for speed management. And that includes things like bulb outs or traffic circles, or sort of tactical urbanism type treatments to slow speeds down. And so I think there's some great examples of how Austin has done it. And it's turned out there was no crazy backlash. And it was during COVID, but the first time the city of Austin passed just a citywide change of the speed limit, we were ready for a crazy fight. And we even knew the kind of people who normally would be real mad about this. There was zero people signed up to oppose it or to comment. There was no sort of big backlash on social media, no editorials, nothing happened. Everybody's happy with it. So I think there's a lot of nice lessons to be learned from how it's actually worked well in the city of Austin. But hopefully a year from now, we'll be working towards passing a bill so that the city of Austin can do 20 miles an hour and the rest of Texas can easily replicate that. So with that, thanks to you all for having me as part of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And it's great to hear about cities like Austin kind of leading as far as they can. But there is that limit from state law, and there's at least 5 states where going to 20 miles per hour for your speed limit is just illegal. And it always seems so odd to me that we make that safest speed something that is very difficult to do or impossible to do, because it's relatively easy to make speed limits higher. It's unfortunately way too complicated to make them lower, even though, as you say, many people want slower speeds. Many people want slower speeds, particularly by where they live. And it can be a unifying and popular issue on that front. So I know we have a few questions in the question and answer. The first one that I want to feature is maybe most relevant to what Mackenzie was talking about, kind of talking about getting pushback from law enforcement. And you said in California, it needs to be set at the 85th percentile to be enforceable. Was there pushback just related to that aspect of enforcement, or were there other variations on that?
Locally, we've had a lot of support from our partners with the police department. They understand the severity of speeding on our streets, and they would prefer that the speed limits be enforceable. I think the tension was, their interest in ensuring accountability and enforceability and our interest in safety were at odds because of the 85th. And so we were agreeing on the issue, but our electeds weren't always agreeing on the solution. And so it was not a one size fits all when we were updating our speed surveys at that time. Some streets, our council members chose to maintain the lower speed limit and not have enforcement. And on other streets, we increased the speed limit in order to have enforcement. And I think PD was a good partner at that time. They also supported us pursuing our reforms to the 85th percentile so that speeds could be enforceable at a safer limit. But I'll say that was not the case at a statewide level. So it's another example of where statewide organizations, particularly unions, were not supportive of our efforts and were some of the most formidable opponents for these bills. But similar to how we had constituents speak for themselves, we asked our police officers and police departments to speak for themselves. And where I think the first attempt at reforming the 85th had really significant opposition from statewide unions and just no voice from local departments. By the third attempt, we had a lot of letters of support from local police departments. And we're able to say, like, look, it might not work for CHP on the freeways, but we're talking about local city streets, and this is what local city enforcement thinks. So it's a mixed bag.
I mean, thank you for doing the work to get people on board over the 3 iterations of the bill. Does anyone else want to touch on kind of the dynamics of law enforcement in pushing for speed limit reform? And the hard part, in my opinion, is we know many people don't comply with the speed limit. We want speed limit compliance. We know safe street designs that promote speed limit compliance will take time. And there's just that tension between getting the roads we want versus kind of being able to enforce those speed limits that we ultimately want in the future. On some streets, you could change the street outside my house to 20 miles per hour and people would probably go that speed. In other streets, that's not going to happen. But the direction we want is clearly slower speeds and over time roads designed for people to naturally comply with those slower speeds.
I can say that in Oregon, it has been a bit of a convenient benefit that we have several former law enforcement officers on the Joint Committee on Transportation, which is the committee through which most of this legislation flows before it hits the main floor in the Oregon legislature. So they do bring their experience in law enforcement and their relationships, obviously, to the conversation. I will say there has been a bit of pushback from the police union on things like the civilian review of the automated traffic enforcement, but that's, I think, an economics issue for them and not necessarily a safety issue. But we haven't always been in lockstep with the police union organizations either, as the street safety advocacy groups. But I can say that there has been that pushback slightly. That said, it's still moved forward. And I think overall what we're hearing from law enforcement is they want everyone to slow down, and they do appreciate the tools at their disposal to help with that. But I don't know how the law enforcement sector is dealing with the speed limit reductions in terms of ticketing. I haven't seen that data.
Which maybe I'll just add that we certainly have had law enforcement strongly supporting Division Zero and sort of the being willing to go to the legislature or go to city council and be like, things need to change. You guys don't understand how bad it is. And so do work with law enforcement because they have the experiences of how bad things are on our streets. There is in Austin, there is a speed related thing. Part of the city's comprehensive speed management program is they developed a high injury network of where the worst places where people are being killed with and speed related crashes. And then Division Zero was paying police to do targeted enforcement of speed in those places. And that's sort of a lot of people are happy about that program. And there's various, seems to be effective at lowering speeds. It seems to be some amount of indications that the equitable approach of pulling people over for doing the worst behaviors in the places where it's causing trouble, that the race and ethnicity of the people being pulled over kind of represents the city and isn't biased and things like that. And so there's and in a way that program has built a partnership between police and the city staff on we need to deal with these places where speeds are a real problem. And so I think there's a lot more there, but there's I think a good partnership there.
Yeah, thanks for all of those perspectives. I want to address one of the questions. Seems to be about a specific road, a 4-lane road with 55-mile-per-hour speed limits that currently has bike ped crossings using rectangular rapid flashing beacons, which if you're not familiar with that technology, it is not something that tells drivers to stop for people crossing the roadway, but it blinks rapidly to tell people driving that there are people crossing the roadway. And this person is kind of looking for advice on what to do to calm traffic on a very high-speed roadway. They have a bunch of homeowners associations, bike clubs, and others engaged. This probably isn't something that is addressed by state speed limit law reform, but is kind of in that how do we target speed reduction question. My advice would be there seems to be a trend that we see in the recently published federal manual on uniform traffic control devices to say when you have crossings of major streets, it's not enough just to do the basic crossing. You need to do a crossing that will actually provide safety. So it might be if you currently have rectangular rapid flashing beacons and they are not providing the level of safety that is needed, you need to look for further engineering measures that will slow folks down. You can have a transition zone where the speed limit is reduced over the course of a couple miles in anticipation of that major crossing. And then you can have like what is called a hawk signal or a standalone crossing signal for that movement across the 55-mile-per-hour roadway. A 55-mile-per-hour roadway is extremely dangerous. If you are hit on a 55-mile-per-hour roadway while walking, you have a worse than 50-50 chance of death. So that danger caused by the physics of crashes needs to be addressed. And that's kind of the approach we want communities and departments of transportation to take. So I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in there, but I wanted to make sure I addressed that.
I can say that one of our winning arguments in pursuing speed limit setting legislation was that the higher the speed limit gets, the fewer treatments we have available to address the issues that we see. And so we need a fighting chance to even implement some of the treatments that we have available to us. And we had so many streets becoming 45 mph, and that's a real threshold where there's not a lot we can do without completely redesigning the road. And that was something that I think was a fairly compelling argument for our legislature.
You know, that's it. With the Texas legislators, if you start talking about the stuff, everyone goes to, oh, you're just trying to do speed traps and that kind of stuff. But we were able to talk about how the speed limit is a barrier on design. And once you start talking about we actually want to make these streets safe, that can work well for some legislators who really don't want to be talking about just pulling people over for speeding kind of thing. So I was also going to add this situation of a high-speed road. There's somewhat of a horrible, ironic situation in Texas where TxDOT standards are that if a road has a certain speed limit, you are not allowed to have pedestrian crossings. You know, and that like you shouldn't have pedestrians be put in that mix sort of thing. And so the NBC DFW did an amazing series on speed, amazingly, and we basically it's our biggest success was getting them to understand the story of speed and design speed. And they talk about this one big street in Dallas where it's a TxDOT facility and it's for 45 mph, but according to TxDOT rules, that means you can't put the pedestrian crossing in. And like everybody's like, what do we do here? And the only answer is that TxDOT has to learn how to have a safe speed. And then you could have the pedestrian crossing. So that if you check out that link, there's some great stuff there of a TV news actually talking about speed, but then that exact examples in there.
Yeah, I've seen that series and it's very good. So definitely check out that link. So there's a question about how do you find your champions? So many of these efforts have been over years. So have you had a champion that has stuck with you throughout the years, or are you always finding new champions? Would someone like to talk about finding your champions for this kind of reform?
I feel like I keep going first, but I'm happy to talk about ours because it truly has been one lawmaker that has led almost every phase of the work that I described, from launching the task force to securing 85th reforms to securing authority for automated speed enforcement. And that was Assemblymember Laura Friedman, who for me very luckily represents parts of Los Angeles, so was a natural partner for us. I think that is not always the case. You may identify a good champion, but not have an inherent relationship with them. That was one of the benefits for us of collaborating across city DOTs, is that my local delegation being a great champion also benefit my sister cities, and we could connect them to the same legislature and the same legislator and the same champion. I also think for us, rather than shifting champions, our patience and our commitment to working with Assemblymember Friedman really paid out when she became the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee. So she had been a longtime champion of street safety issues. And once she was put in a position where she could really, even beyond running her own bills, be a large part, a very powerful source of change. We had done all of that groundwork with her. And her being chair was just a huge boon to us securing some of that legislation. So she presented herself naturally, but I think for us, the commitment to working with her over the course of years, and to making sure that other cities could benefit from her being such a great champion were two key pieces of success.
Maybe I'll add to that, that we have worked very, very hard to have a bipartisan approach and to have Democrats and Republicans okay with this. But our actual bill champions have been in the category of sort of effective Democrats. And maybe my lesson would be, that's okay. and like it is okay. And to some extent, it might make sense. And in another further tangent is all of our bill author leads have been Hispanic women. And it's somehow it made sense that the people who were leading on our bills were talking from a sort of moral authority about like, we want our community to be safe. And maybe it's not because they're Hispanic or women, but the people involved were seen as their legitimate voice for wanting my community to be safe. And so anyway, but the point was it was even in a red state, we made it became okay that we had Democrat leads because they could sort of tell the story of how and why. So
Yeah, I would echo that a bit. We've been working pretty actively the last couple of years from the advocacy side on a couple of fronts. One is safety is not a partisan issue, and most of our lawmakers, regardless of their affiliation, and even across the urban-rural divide, have one of these deadly stretches in their communities, in their jurisdictions. So thinking about, when someone tragically, but oftentimes predictably is killed or seriously injured on one of those roadways, connecting with them about possible solutions is pretty important. And we're trying to grow the Families for Safe Streets effort here in Oregon, but it is a bit hard since that is a survivors group. One of the other things, everything's coalition politics for us here. So, but when we've been thinking a little bit less traditionally about coalitions, it's not just on the nonprofit advocacy. Again, I'm speaking as a nonprofit director, advocacy director, but thinking about what does it mean for the advocacy organizations, especially around safety or even things like transit access, complete streets, to work more closely with the other types of coalitions that emerge, whether that's the Associated Cities, we've got League of Oregon Cities, which all of these cities come together in rooms to talk about safety, the county governments, again, connecting our advocacy with those county government organizations, and then just making sure that we're networked into all of the transportation lobbies so that we can really infiltrate, and I mean that in a very positive way, with that safety framing about it being nonpartisan, everybody's issue, and everybody having something to contribute to that change making so that we can stop, the deaths in our community, because it really is, to Jay's point, that moral legitimacy and that community ground truthing, I think, are pretty critical in getting widespread buy-in for some of the changes that we need to make.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing those perspectives. There's a lot of interest in the Q&A around automated enforcement and kind of how that works, whether those funds can be dedicated towards street safety improvements, how it compares to pushback around speed traps or states that might make automated enforcement illegal because they're worried about creating speed traps. Sarah, I know you talked about upcoming legislation that would include civilian review. Does that also include designating those funds towards a particular safety use? And would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, and I'm happy to drop our testimony in the chat. In 2022, HB 4105-1 did pass, which is the civilian review of the traffic cams, and in 2023 they expanded that beyond City of Portland. I have not seen the budget numbers locally in Portland, in part because what we keep hearing from jurisdictions is about supply chain issues with getting the ATE installed. Some of those are on the hardware side and some of those are on the software side, honestly. But we are looking at a big tranche getting installed this year. So hopefully we'll have better data after that. But our recommendations, along with the civilian review, were for jurisdictions to not create perverse incentives for generating revenue off of this. What we really wanted to do was apply this regulatory frame, if you will, through that equity lens, which we take in all of our work, which is making sure that things are scaled progressively, that we're not creating, again, perverse incentives for local jurisdictions to generate excessive revenue, because we know that historically BIPOC and low income community members have been disproportionately negatively affected by over enforcement. And thinking about, how can we all work together to come up with a progressive system that doesn't harm people who are already most at risk. That's the frame that we set out, but whether or not the numbers are going to meet that once we actually get all those ATEs in, I think we're going to have to track the data and look at it that way. And we'll keep you up to date as we hear more, but again, just waiting for them to all get installed, actually.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And yeah, it's important to check the data and see how things actually work in implementation. I know a lot of folks who are interested in automated enforcement for the reason that it is potentially colorblind in its enforcement, but there's many places where the data has borne out that it is not affecting all populations the same way. So how that is implemented is very important. Our Slow Roads Saves Lives message is really focused on making sure we can have roads designed and signed for appropriate speed limits. We want natural compliance with the speed limit, if possible. So making sure that the road has that target speed of the speed limit or slightly lower, so that we are getting people to slow down because they look at the road and they see that they should go a slower speed on the road, rather than just being scared of enforcement. So enforcement is one of the approaches that the United States uses a lot, but it is not the only approach to achieve compliance. So we have a few minutes left here, and I appreciate you putting your testimony in the chat. Are there kind of any other closing remarks you would like to add? There's a few things in the Q&A about specific kind of traffic calming implementations, like narrower lane widths, or things like traffic circles that aren't always embraced, but do a very good job of getting people to go slower. But I know we just have 3 minutes left, so if there's something you would like to mention that we haven't mentioned yet, please feel free to take that time now to get that last word in.
I'm just going to drop in the chat that Great Streets, Complete Streets funding program out of Oregon. What I think folks should look at here is the equity and climate frames of evaluation that they developed through that, because in my opinion, that's the direction we should be headed for all these streets investments. So I'll just leave that there for folks to review. But in terms of those complete streets investments, I'm pretty excited about the direction that one's trending.
Well, I'll just leave everybody with it's worth it to keep going. And like, it turns out that there are lots of people out there who really want their street to be safer, and that legislators, regardless of where they come from or their ideological bent, they know that, and they have neighborhood associations who are mad. So like, but they do need you saying that something could be changed here, and the legislators don't know that. They don't know about design speed. They don't know about roundabouts. So just keep trying.
The words out of my mouth, I think such a worthy fight. It's totally possible to succeed. Keep it up. I think, even when you don't succeed in one session, you do learn each time. So make sure to like lick your wounds, but then figure out what you can learn from the time that you weren't successful and really incorporate that into any future attempts. Don't go it alone. Build really strong, maybe unexpected coalitions, and just keep at it. Feels good when you do it.
Yeah, I mean, the recommendation for 30 mile per hour speed limits in urban and residential areas is like straight out of 1955, when this private committee called the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Laws and Ordinances raised its recommended urban and residential district speed limits. So like we have just decades of kind of built up bad decisions around safer speed limits. And there's no better time than today to make the safer choice, the easy choice, make 20 miles per hour something that every community can pursue. And I think Jay's definitely right. There's a lot of neighborhood groups and folks who are supportive and will be supportive of safer speeds. And we have all of that power to draw on. So with that, I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank the attendees. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but we're excited to keep pushing on this issue. We're going to have more Slow Roads Saves Lives webinars in the future. And I, wish everyone good luck with their continued efforts to reform this most important issue. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thanks for hosting. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, you too.